Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notifications so that you will enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Pastor Daniel Adeoye stood like a pillar of strength behind the polished mahogany pulpit of Living Word Ministries, his voice booming across the sanctuary like a wave crashing on sacred shores. The choir's final note had barely faded when he raised his hand and began his sermon, delivering with the fiery passion that had become his trademark. Sweat trickled down his brow as he paced the altar, quoting Proverbs with precision and power. A good name is better than riches. His message was one of integrity, humility, and trust in God, laced with anecdotes of struggle, faith, and divine intervention. The congregation soaked in every word, clapping, nodding, crying. Daniel's words didn't just teach, they pierced, they healed. And when he raised his arms to close the sermon in prayer, his voice trembled with conviction, the Holy Spirit thick in the air like incense. Behind him, the church banner flapped gently from the air conditioning, inscribed with the ministry's motto, "Building families in truth and faith." That motto mirrored Daniel's life, or so he thought. Outside the spiritual storm of the altar, Daniel's personal life painted a picture of peace and favor. He and his wife, Ifeoma, were the embodiment of godly marriage. 13 years together, standing side by side through storms and sunshine. Ifeoma was graceful, intelligent, and deeply devoted to her husband's ministry. She ran the women's fellowship, mentored young wives, and never missed a morning prayer. Their son, David, now 8, was their miracle child, born after 7 years of prayer, fasting, and medical consultations. He had the bright eyes of his mother and the sharp chin of his father, a boy who was destined, people said, to follow in Daniel's footsteps. To the public, the Adeoyes were a holy trinity of joy, the perfect father, the perfect mother, and the perfect son. But beneath that shiny surface were tiny cracks, subtle glances, quiet moments of detachment, and buried secrets neither Daniel nor Ifeoma had the courage to dig up. Still, love and ministry kept them afloat, giving no space for suspicion. That Sunday afternoon, after the service had ended and the congregation dispersed with hugs and handshakes, Daniel lingered in his office. He sat behind his desk, unclasping his wristwatch, eyes drifting to the framed photo on the wall. It was a family portrait taken 3 months prior, David grinning in the middle, Ifeoma's hand on his shoulder, and Daniel standing tall behind them both. The picture had always filled him with pride, but today he stared at it longer than usual. Something inside him stirred, a flicker of unrest he couldn't quite name. He brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion, and reached for his Bible. But the weight of responsibility pressed on his chest. Being a pastor was more than preaching. It was sacrifice, discipline, and constant self-denial. Yet, no amount of prayer could have prepared him for the tragedy that was about to enter his house. Not through sickness or loss, but through the one thing he preached against most, betrayal. Far from the holiness of Daniel's world stood Michael Adeoye, the younger brother whose name had all but been scrubbed from family conversations. Once best friends in childhood, the brothers now lived as strangers separated by years of bitterness and unspoken pain. Michael was the manager of one of the top construction firms in Lagos, known for his sharp business acumen and cold, pragmatic demeanor. Where Daniel had taken the path of the pulpit, Michael had chosen the path of profit, diving deep into the secular world Daniel often preached against. He was rich, successful, and unapologetic about how he achieved it. Women, power, alcohol. Michael made no excuses. He had no use for the church, and certainly no patience for a brother he saw as a hypocrite cloaked in righteousness. Yet despite their estrangement, fate had a cruel way of keeping blood connected. They lived in the same city, moved in distant but occasionally intersecting circles, and carried a wound neither was willing to dress. The tension between the brothers dated back more than a decade, to the early days of Daniel's marriage. After Daniel had left university and struggled to find a job, it was Michael who held the keys to opportunity. Michael, then already climbing the corporate ladder, had connections. Ifeoma, desperate to help her husband, had approached him quietly. What followed was never discussed openly, not between the brothers, not even between Daniel and Ifeoma. But after Daniel got the job offer through Michael's influence, the relationship between the brothers dissolved. Daniel sensed something wasn't right, but Ifeoma had insisted it was just pride. Time created distance and silence built walls. Eventually, Michael stopped coming to family gatherings. He never visited their church, never met his nephew, and when their mother died he only showed up briefly at the funeral, standing in the back with sunglasses on like a stranger. Daniel had tried once or twice to reconnect, but the wall was too high. Forgiveness was easy to preach, but much harder to practice when trust had rotted at the root. Despite the distance, Michael still cast a shadow over Daniel's life. His name would occasionally come up in conversations at church. "Isn't your brother the one managing that new company near Lekki?" And Daniel would always offer a stiff smile and change the subject. Ifeoma never mentioned him at all, which Daniel assumed was out of loyalty. David had no clue he even had an uncle. But deep in Daniel's heart, there was an unspoken insecurity, the sense that Michael had something over him. A favor owed, a debt unpaid. That unease would resurface when he prayed alone at night, whispering in his thoughts like a demon in the dark. He told himself that whatever had happened back then didn't matter. Life had moved on. He had his family, his church, his purpose. But life, it seemed, was not finished with the Adeoye brothers. And the next time Daniel would see Michael, it wouldn't be over dinner or a phone call. It would be at the breaking point of his soul. It began with a fever. David, usually full of life and mischief, returned home from school looking pale and weak. Ifeoma thought it was the flu at first, gave him warm tea and paracetamol, laid him in bed, and whispered prayers over his little body. But the fever spiked overnight. He began vomiting, his body trembling with chills. By morning he was barely conscious and panic gripped her heart. Daniel rushed them to the hospital, his hands cold on the steering wheel as Ifeoma held their son in the back seat, praying desperately under her breath. At St. Raphael's Medical Center, the doctors examined David and recommended immediate admission. Blood tests were run, vitals checked, and tubes attached. The diagnosis: acute hemolytic anemia. He needed a transfusion, urgently. Relief briefly washed over Daniel. He was the father. He would donate. He sat down, rolled up his sleeve, and smiled at the nurse. "Let's get started." Then came the silence. The kind that could drain the color from a man's face. The nurse returned, brows furrowed, and quietly asked Daniel to follow her. In the lab, the head technician greeted him awkwardly. "Sir, there seems to be a problem," he said, flipping through a folder. "You and your son do not share compatible blood types. In fact, it's not just incompatible. It's genetically impossible for you to be his biological father." The word struck Daniel like a sledgehammer to the chest. At first he laughed, accused them of error, demanded retests. But 3 tests later the results were consistent. A negative father. AB-positive child. Not just unlikely, biologically implausible. Daniel staggered out of the room, stumbling like a drunk man. He didn't return to the hospital room immediately. He found a chair near the emergency exit and sat in stunned silence. His mind refused to connect the dots. This had to be a mistake, a swap at birth, something else. Anything else. When he finally returned to Ifeoma's side, he was quiet. She looked up at him with hopeful eyes, asking, "Did everything go well?" But the fire in his eyes betrayed him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice dry. Her smile faded instantly. That night, after David had received blood from a donor and drifted into sleep, Daniel and Ifeoma sat in the car outside the hospital in heavy silence. "Who is his father, Ifeoma?" Daniel finally asked, every syllable razor-sharp. Her hands began to shake. "I don't understand," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't lie to me. The tests don't lie. I want the truth. Now." And in that moment she broke, like glass under pressure. Through sobs and trembling confessions she told him everything. The job, the desperate visit to Michael, the one night she never spoke of again. She had kept it buried, praying it would never surface. But the truth had found its way out, as it always does. And with it, the world Daniel knew was shattered into dust. Daniel drove home in silence, the weight of the confession pressing against his chest like a stone slab. Ifeoma sat beside him, weeping softly, her head pressed against the window. The silence between them was louder than any scream. At home he went straight to the bedroom, shut the door, and collapsed on the bed. His heart pounded as if trying to escape his ribcage. Everything he had known, his love, his family, his pride, was now entangled in betrayal. The boy he had held as a newborn, raised with love and called my legacy, was not his by blood. Worse still, he was the product of a hidden sin between his wife and his estranged brother. Daniel curled his fists into the bedsheets, rage burning through him. He tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. How does a man of God pray through betrayal? What scripture could comfort a broken man when his own household had stabbed him in the heart? As dawn approached, Daniel found himself in his study, staring at old photographs. One was a picture from the early days of his marriage. Him, Ifeoma, and Michael at a dinner table. Michael had his arm around both of them, grinning like a fox. Daniel stared at it for what felt like hours, his breathing shallow. He remembered the nights Iphioma had been strangely distant, the brief glint of discomfort whenever Michael's name came up, the job offer that came too easily. The puzzle pieces all slid into place. And now it was too late to go back. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional. His trust had been violated by the two people closest to him. He felt hollow, a shell of the man he once was. Worse yet, he couldn't let anyone know. What would the church say? What would his elders think? The man who preached integrity, now humiliated in his own home. But beneath the pain was something darker growing, something Daniel had never felt before, the seed of vengeance. He tried to suppress it, to drown it in prayer, but it sprouted in the soil of his heartbreak. He began to imagine scenarios. What if Michael had planned it? What if it wasn't just a one-time thing? What if David wasn't the only consequence? His thoughts turned to judgment, righteous judgment. He remembered the story of Cain and Abel. Brothers turned enemies. Blood on the earth. And a voice from heaven asking, "Where is your brother?" Daniel clenched his jaw. Maybe some sins were unforgivable. Maybe some betrayals demanded more than prayer. Maybe justice had to be delivered by hand. The morning after Iphioma's confession felt like a bad dream wrapped in the soft lies of sunlight. Daniel sat in the living room, hands clasped between his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. Iphioma stood near the kitchen doorway, watching him like a ghost might observe a mourner. She had barely slept. Her eyes were puffy and rimmed with red, her voice hoarse from crying through the night. But Daniel didn't speak to her. Not a word. Not a glance. The silence between them wasn't just silence. It was a wall, thick and soundproof, built from every shattered vow and broken piece of trust. She had spent the night in the guest room after he refused to share their bed, lying awake and whispering prayers of forgiveness that never reached heaven. In her heart, she knew what she had done was unforgivable. She had lived with it for years, buried it beneath good deeds and motherhood. But the truth had its own schedule. It always arrived, sooner or later, dragging its consequences like a storm on the horizon. Daniel didn't go to church that morning. He told the assistant pastor to lead service. It was the first time he had ever done that without a prior announcement. The congregation whispered and speculated, but no one dared question the absence of their spiritual father. He sat alone at home, scrolling through old family pictures, each one feeling like a lie. Every birthday party, every family vacation, every Father's Day card David had made, none of it felt real anymore. He wanted to hate the boy, but he couldn't. David was innocent. A child born into a mess he never created. Still, Daniel couldn't help but feel cheated. He had poured himself into fatherhood, prayed with David every night, taught him the scriptures, laughed at his silly jokes. And now he couldn't even look at him without seeing Michael's shadow lurking in his features. Every time David smiled, it felt like a mockery. Every "Daddy, I love you" was a dagger in his chest. Yet he said nothing. Daniel was a man of restraint, but even restraint has a limit. Iphioma tried to fix it, to say something, anything, that could undo the damage. But what words could heal that kind of wound? She approached Daniel in the living room and knelt before him, tears rolling freely. "I'm sorry. I was desperate. I thought I was helping you. I never wanted this." Her voice broke, but Daniel didn't move. He didn't lift his eyes, didn't speak. She placed her hands on his knees, but he stood up immediately, stepping away like she was a flame about to burn him. "Don't," he finally said, his voice low and dry. "Don't touch me. Don't talk to me. I don't know who you are." Her sobs filled the silence, echoing through the house like a funeral dirge. Daniel left her there on the floor, walked into his study and locked the door behind him. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, unaware that within the walls of the Adioi home, a storm of silence was growing stronger with each passing hour. It had been 9 years ago, and the memory still burned in Iphioma's mind like a scar that refused to fade. Daniel had just been ordained, full of dreams and sermons, but their bank account had been empty. He had tried for months to secure a position in an established church or land a stable job to support the ministry. But the offers never came. They lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, eating Gary and groundnut for dinner and borrowing from church members in secret. One day, Iphioma overheard a conversation at the salon. Michael Adioi, Daniel's estranged brother, had recently been made regional manager of mainland properties and was recruiting. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but something inside her whispered that he might help. Daniel had forbidden her from ever contacting Michael again, but desperation doesn't ask for permission, it acts. That night, while Daniel was leading vigil, she slipped out of the house, took a cab to Michael's office, and waited by the reception until he came out. Michael was surprised to see her, leaning back in his chair with a smirk she still remembered vividly. He looked richer, more powerful, and far colder than before. At first he refused to help. "Daniel wants nothing to do with me," he said, sipping whiskey. "Now he needs me?" But Ifeoma pleaded, told him it wasn't for Daniel's sake but for their survival. She begged him to show mercy, appealed to their past, reminded him of the bond they once shared. Michael's eyes had changed then. He stood from behind his desk, walked toward her slowly, and said the words that froze her blood. "What's in it for me?" The tension in the room was suffocating. She had stood there, caught between disgust and desperation, and made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. That night was never spoken of again. By morning, Michael sent an email to HR recommending Daniel for a consultancy role, and life began to improve. Ifeoma buried the guilt so deep it almost felt like it never happened. Until now. Even after all these years, she had kept that night locked in a vault of silence. Every time Daniel mentioned the job blessing, she smiled faintly and looked away. Every time she saw David laughing in the garden, she forced herself to believe he was Daniel's son, because he had to be. She had told herself it was just one night, a mistake made in the fog of hardship. But mistakes have consequences, and some consequences have names. Now the truth had torn through the fragile peace they had built, reducing everything to rubble. She knew she was wrong. But she also knew she was human. Her sin hadn't been born of lust, but of fear. Fear of watching her husband drown in frustration, fear of raising a child in poverty, fear of failing as a wife. Still, none of that mattered anymore. Daniel's eyes were no longer eyes of a husband. They were the eyes of a stranger staring at a betrayal too painful to forgive. Daniel stared at his son now with a different lens, one that filtered every smile, every word, every gesture through suspicion and sorrow. David, unaware of the chaos boiling beneath the surface of his home, continued to be the cheerful boy he had always been. He laughed during cartoons, asked endless questions about the Bible, and loved to play soccer in the backyard. But Daniel could barely meet his eyes. Every feature he once saw as his own now appeared foreign. Was that Michael's nose? Was that his smirk when he cracked a joke? The uncertainty tormented him, clawing at his mind day and night. Sometimes he wanted to grab the boy and hold him close, scream into his tiny chest, "Why aren't you mine?" But then guilt would overwhelm him and he'd retreat back into silence. He hated himself for feeling this way, hated that he couldn't separate the boy from the betrayal. But love and logic often fail in the face of broken trust. Church services became mechanical. Daniel preached with fire, but the fire came from a place of pain. His sermons grew darker, laced with references to betrayal, sin, and vengeance. His congregation noticed the change. The assistant pastor approached him one evening and asked gently, "Sir, are you all right?" Daniel nodded, forced a smile, and said, "I'm fine. Just the weight of the cross." But inside he was unraveling. At night, he found himself reading scriptures about judgment, about divine justice, about the punishment for adultery. He found himself drawn to the Old Testament, where fire rained from heaven and traitors were swallowed by the earth. Ifeoma noticed the shift too. He no longer prayed with her, no longer touched her, no longer called her by name. The house felt colder than ever, even with all the windows shut. And David, poor David, didn't understand why his father now watched him with hollow eyes. One night, David walked into the study holding a hand-drawn picture. His attempt at a family portrait. He had drawn himself, holding hands with Mummy and Daddy, with big smiles on all their faces. "Look what I made for you," he said, beaming. Daniel stared at the picture, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. He took the paper, nodded slowly, and whispered, "Thank you, son." David ran off happy. But Daniel placed the picture in a drawer and locked it away. He couldn't bear to see it again. The next day he called an old friend who had ties to a private investigator. "I need information on my brother," he said flatly. Discreetly. The friend asked no questions. Daniel ended the call and stared out the window. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. Maybe proof that Michael had planned this all along. Maybe a reason to justify the rage brewing inside him. Either way, one thing was becoming painfully clear. Forgiveness was no longer on the table. Daniel stood before his mirror in full clergy robe, the white collar around his neck suddenly feeling like a noose. He had worn that collar for over a decade, a symbol of his calling, his purpose, his surrender to God. But now it felt like a lie choking him slowly. How could he stand before his flock and speak of truth when his own home was built on deception? How could he preach about forgiveness when he nurtured hatred in his heart like a hidden flame? The collar once made him feel powerful, chosen, ordained. Now it mocked him. He touched the wooden cross pendant that hung from his neck and closed his eyes. God, he whispered, why did you let this happen? But heaven was silent. No signs. No comfort. Just the sound of his own heartbeat thudding heavily in his ears. He wanted to scream, to tear the robe from his body and walk away from it all. But the Sunday service awaited. And so did the people, thousands of them looking for hope, while he drowned in despair. That morning's sermon was the darkest he had ever preached. The topic, the price of betrayal. He quoted Judas. He spoke of hidden sins, of serpents in gardens, of the way love turns to wrath when trust is broken. His voice thundered through the hall, filled with pain masked as passion. The church erupted in applause, thinking the intensity was divine inspiration. But it wasn't. It was a man bleeding on the inside, trying to make sense of a wound he couldn't show anyone. After the service, a few elders gathered to praise him, saying it was his most powerful message yet. Daniel nodded, smiled, and thanked them. But inside he felt like a fraud. He returned home, removed his collar, and threw it on the floor. I am no man of God, he whispered to himself. Not anymore. That night, Daniel sat in his study and opened his Bible, not for guidance, but for confirmation. He read stories of men who had taken justice into their own hands. Moses, who killed the Egyptian. David, who had Uriah slain. Cain, who murdered his brother. He lingered on that last one. Am I my brother's keeper? Cain had asked. The verse echoed in Daniel's mind like a bell tolling judgment. He closed the Bible slowly, stood up, and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, Michael was living his life, probably unaware that the truth had surfaced. Probably laughing. Maybe even boasting to himself that he had taken what Daniel treasured most. And Daniel couldn't pray it away anymore. The weight of the collar was too heavy. And the only thing that felt light was the idea of revenge. Daniel stood outside the polished glass doors of Mainland Properties, staring up at the towering building that gleamed in the Lagos sun like a monument to pride. He hadn't seen his brother face to face in nearly 5 years, but today he didn't care about time or distance. Today he had come for answers. Answers only Michael could give. He marched past reception, ignoring the startled greeting of the secretary, and took the elevator straight to the top floor. When the doors opened, Michael's personal assistant jumped to her feet, but Daniel pushed past her and opened the office door without knocking. Michael sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, casually sipping espresso and reviewing blueprints. When he looked up and saw Daniel, he didn't flinch. He smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said, Well, look who finally remembered he has a brother. The room pulsed with tension as Daniel closed the door behind him and stepped forward, his fists clenched. Tell me the truth, he said, his voice low and trembling. Is David your son? Michael blinked, then laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that made Daniel's skin crawl. So, she finally told you, Michael said, rising from his seat and walking slowly around the desk. Took her long enough. Honestly, I thought she'd take it to the grave. Daniel's face tightened. It was one night. You knew she was my wife. Michael shrugged, moving to pour himself a drink. She came to me. I didn't force her. She wanted to help you, remember? I gave you a job, didn't I? Gave you a future. Daniel's hands shook with rage. You think this was charity? You think this gives you the right? Michael interrupted, raising his glass. It's not about rights, Daniel. It's about reality. You needed help. I helped. And now you're angry because the boy you love isn't yours? That's life. Daniel wanted to lunge at him. To wrap his hands around Michael's throat and squeeze until every smug word disappeared. But he didn't. He turned away, breathing heavily, trying to keep the storm inside from exploding. You ruined everything, he said quietly. You took my son from me. Michael chuckled and sat back down, unbothered. He was never yours to begin with. Those words struck Daniel like a hammer. He walked out of the office in silence, his heart thudding in his chest like war drums. As he exited the building, the sun seemed dimmer, the street sounds dull. His thoughts were a swirl of pain and fury. Michael had confirmed it without remorse. He didn't care. He never had. And somehow that made it worse. Not just the betrayal, but the arrogance, the pride, the smirk. Daniel walked to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a pastor. He felt like a man who wanted to kill. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. In churches, salons, and after-school pickup zones, the story began to leak, first as a murmur, then as a storm. Pastor Daniel hasn't been the same lately, they said. He looks tired, angry, lost. Rumors bred faster than fruit flies, that he had stepped down from ministry, that he had marital issues, that he was battling a hidden illness. And then, one whisper louder than the rest, someone said David isn't even his biological son. It spread like wildfire, igniting suspicion and gossip among the congregation. Church elders called for meetings, asking Daniel if there was anything he needed to confess. But he waved them off with vague reassurances. He knew the wolves were circling, but he didn't care anymore. Let them talk. Let them judge. The truth was too complicated for Sunday lips. Iphioma, once revered as the elegant First Lady of Living Word Ministries, now walked through the church halls with downcast eyes. Some women stopped talking when she passed. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Even her inner circle began to distance themselves, afraid of association. She held her head up when she could, but inside, shame coiled around her like a snake. She tried to keep David sheltered from it all, but the tension at home was palpable. He noticed the silence at the dinner table, the closed-door arguments, the way his father no longer picked him up or ruffled his hair. At school, one of the boys teased him, "You're not even your daddy's real son." David came home that day and asked, "Mommy, what does that mean?" Iphioma had no answer. She simply held him and cried. Daniel's sermons became colder, shorter, more cryptic. He barely looked at the congregation, his once loving tone replaced by a biting edge. Attendance dropped. Tithes reduced. Church leaders began to worry, and one Sunday, after another dark sermon about betrayal, an elder pulled him aside. "Sir, we're concerned. The flock is unsettled." Daniel stared at him blankly. "Let them be." The elder hesitated. "Should we arrange for counseling? Maybe a sabbatical?" Daniel turned away. "I don't need help. I need silence." That week, he removed the family photos from his office and stopped attending midweek services. The once vibrant center of faith now echoed with emptiness. The man who had brought healing to others was now infected with an anger that no prayer seemed to cure. And deep inside, a voice kept whispering, "He deserves to pay. He took everything from you. This cannot end in peace." Daniel stopped sleeping in the bedroom. He moved permanently into the guest room, locking the door at night and emerging only when David was asleep or at school. He no longer answered phone calls unless they were from church officials, and even those he kept short. His meals were minimal. Sometimes he would sit by the window for hours, watching the leaves fall from the compound's lone mango tree. Iphioma tried to talk to him, tried to reach for the man she had married, but he was gone, buried beneath layers of resentment. One night, she slid a plate of jollof rice under his door with a note that said, "I love you. I never stopped." The next morning, the plate was still full, untouched. She cried on the bathroom floor for an hour, muffling her sobs into a towel. The man who once held her hand through labor, who once prayed over her when she was sick, now treated her like an enemy. At church, things continued to deteriorate. A small group of elders demanded an explanation for Daniel's behavior. "You are the shepherd," they said. "You cannot bleed in secret while your flock starves." But Daniel gave them nothing. Eventually, whispers turned into meetings behind closed doors. Some leaders suggested placing him on spiritual leave until he recovered. Others feared a full-blown scandal would break the church. And all the while, Daniel felt himself drifting, away from ministry, away from family, away from God. The Bible that once brought him peace now felt heavy in his hands. His prayers were dry and mechanical, like reciting a speech he no longer believed. In moments of solitude, he found himself watching videos of court trials, criminal psychology documentaries, and sermons on divine justice. He wasn't looking for healing anymore. He was looking for clarity, some internal permission to cross the line he had always feared. At night, when the world was quiet and his mind refused to sleep, Daniel would go into his study and stare at old photographs of Michael. He would imagine different scenarios, confronting him again, exposing him to the church, or even something darker. Each time he walked a little further into that fantasy, and each time it felt less like a sin and more like destiny. He started researching poisons, discreet methods, tracking phone habits. Not because he had made a decision yet, but because the thought gave him control. He needed that. He needed to feel like he had power again. Vengeance was no longer an abstract idea. It was becoming a plan. And each day that passed in isolation, each hour soaked in silence and rage, Daniel inched closer to the moment where thought would become action. Where prayer would be replaced by punishment, Ifeoma stood at the kitchen sink one morning, hands immersed in soapy water, staring out the window as the sun rose behind the trees. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her cheeks were sunken, her spirit weary. The home she once nurtured with love and prayer had become a graveyard of guilt. She had begged God for mercy, fasted, cried, laid flat on the floor in intercession. But Daniel remained stone cold, distant, unreachable. Every day she watched him slip further away. And every day she questioned if she should have told the truth. Maybe some secrets should die. Maybe peace sometimes came from silence. But the truth was now out, and its price was being paid in loneliness and shame. She regretted what happened with Michael, not just the act but the decision. That moment of desperation had birthed a lifetime of consequences. And the worst part? She had lost her husband without even burying him. One night she knocked softly on the guest room door, whispering through the wood, "Please, let's talk. For David's sake. Please, Daniel." No reply. Only silence. She slid a handwritten letter under the door. In it she poured her heart out, how she had struggled in those early years, how the night with Michael wasn't love or lust, but despair and pressure. How she had hated herself every day since. How David had become her redemption, her reason to live. She ended the letter with, "If I could undo it, I would. But I can't. Please don't let this destroy you." The next morning the letter was still lying untouched, folded in half, right where she left it. The message was clear. Daniel was no longer listening. Still she refused to give up. She began leaving Bible verses on his door, playing gospel music softly in the living room, trying to infuse the house with hope. She took David out on long walks, answered his questions with vague smiles, told him Daddy was just going through a hard time. But David wasn't a fool. He was quiet now, observant. He knew something had changed, even if he didn't know what. And Ifeoma feared what would happen if the truth ever reached his ears. What if he found out who his real father was? What if he stopped calling Daniel Daddy? The thought alone shattered her. She prayed that day would never come. But in her heart, she knew it was only a matter of time. The truth always finds its way. And sometimes, when it does, it burns everything in its path. Daniel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with the calculated calm of a man preparing for war. His reflection looked hollow-eyed, aged by grief, but steady. The plan had taken shape over weeks, quietly, meticulously. He had reached the limit of prayer. No more fast. No more waiting on divine vengeance. If the heavens were silent, then he would act on earth. He began reaching out under the pretense of reconciliation, sending Michael a message with carefully chosen words. "Let's talk. I want to end this the right way." Michael, as arrogant as ever, responded with amusement. "Finally. Took you long enough." Daniel suggested a retreat, something private outside the city. A weekend to clear the air, to heal old wounds. Michael, intrigued and perhaps curious about his brother's sudden change of tone, agreed. He offered to drive. Daniel declined. "I'll handle everything," he said. "Just bring yourself." He told Ifeoma nothing. He moved through the house like a ghost, packing a small duffel bag with a Bible, some clothes, and something darker hidden beneath the folds, a vial of crushed sleeping pills, collected discreetly over several weeks. His plan wasn't solidified in blood just yet, but he knew he needed the option. Something to put Michael down, something that gave him the upper hand. Still, part of him wondered if he could actually go through with it. Could he truly murder his own brother? A man of God turned executioner? But that same night, while packing, he stumbled across a forgotten Father's Day card from David, "To the best daddy in the world." The handwriting was crooked, the drawing of a stick-figure family wobbly but sincere. And that was all it took. The rage roared back, washing away every doubt. Michael had stolen that child's origin, his name, his right to truth. There were some sins no apology could erase. The retreat was set in a remote area near Ijebu, wooded, quiet, with only a small lodge and a lake nearby. Daniel arrived early, checked into the cabin, and walked the grounds, memorizing every tree, every possible exit, every blind spot. When Michael arrived later that afternoon in a black SUV, he looked around with amusement. "Wow, you actually went through with this. Nature suits you," he said, stepping out with a smug grin. Daniel smiled back, masking the storm within. "Let's take the weekend to talk. Just us. No past. No drama." They drank that night, Daniel barely sipping, Michael indulging. They played old board games, reminisced over childhood memories, laughed hollow laughs that meant nothing. And all the while, Daniel studied his brother's every move, weighing every opportunity. It was working. The performance was flawless. But what lay ahead would demand more than pretense. It would demand something irreversible. The question was no longer if he would do it, but how soon. The morning sun crept through the trees as birds chirped in the distance, but inside the cabin, silence ruled. Daniel stood by the window, sipping tea as he watched Michael snore on the couch, half covered in a blanket. The night before had been easy, too easy. Michael, high on liquor and pride, had talked for hours, boasting about his company, his women, and subtly jabbing at Daniel's holy act. At one point he even chuckled and said, "I honestly didn't think you had it in you, to face me like this. Guess the collar's tighter than I thought." Daniel had smiled. Said nothing. But inside, a fire raged hotter than ever. Today was the day. He could feel it in his bones. The tension between them was no longer hidden. Every word spoken was laced with history, each smile a mask for contempt. Daniel had rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. He would wait until after breakfast, lead him to the lake, finish it there. Quiet, clean, final. As Michael finally stirred, stretching and yawning, Daniel handed him a cup of hot coffee and forced a brotherly smile. "Slept well?" he asked. Michael shrugged. "Like a baby? This place is actually nice. Peaceful. You sure you're not planning to bury me in the woods?" He laughed. Daniel chuckled back, his hand steady. "Not yet." They sat outside on wooden chairs, sipping in silence for a while. Then Michael said something that cracked the surface. "I've thought about him, you know. David. He's got your discipline. But the eyes, those are mine." Daniel's cup froze midair. "Don't do that," he said flatly. Michael raised a brow. "Do what?" "I'm just saying. The truth's out now. What's the point of pretending?" Daniel stared at him, jaw tightening. "He's not your son." "Not really." Michael laughed again, shrugging. "Say that if it helps you sleep. But blood speaks, Daniel. He'll know one day. And when he does, he'll come looking." That was it. The final thread snapped. Daniel stood, motioning toward the lake path. "Walk with me." Michael followed, hands in his pockets, unaware that death was pacing beside him. They reached the clearing, water glistening under the sun, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. Daniel stopped by the edge. "This is where Dad used to bring us," he said. Michael nodded. "You always cried when he made you swim." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not crying anymore." Before Michael could ask what that meant, Daniel reached into his pocket. Time slowed. His hand brushed the edge of the vial, but before he could draw it, Michael turned and asked, "What's this really about, Daniel? Redemption? Revenge?" Daniel stared at him, his voice low, raw. "It's about justice." And with that, he lunged, not with the vial but with his bare hands, shoving his brother hard. Michael stumbled, slipped on the wet grass and toppled into the lake. The splash echoed through the trees. Daniel stood still, watching the water ripple. Michael surfaced, coughing and sputtering. "You crazy bastard," he screamed. But Daniel didn't move. He simply watched. Not with fear but with a terrifying calm. Because in that moment Daniel knew, one way or another it would end today. The struggle that followed was fierce, desperate and primal. Michael clawed his way to the lake's edge, soaked and gasping, but Daniel was already there, waiting. He grabbed Michael by the collar and dragged him further into the trees. Michael fought back, landing a punch that caught Daniel across the jaw, splitting his lip. But Daniel didn't stop. His body moved on pure instinct, powered by grief, betrayal, and rage that had fermented into something darker than hate. They wrestled in the dirt, branches snapping underfoot, fists flying. At one point Michael begged, "Daniel, stop. What are you doing?" But the words didn't land. Daniel heard only echoes of David's laughter, Iphioma's tears, and the crushing sound of his own heart breaking. The final blow came fast. Daniel pinned Michael down, straddling his chest, and pressed the crushed pill powder into his mouth, forcing him to swallow. Michael thrashed, gurgling, trying to scream, but Daniel held firm. Within minutes, his body went limp, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Daniel knelt over him, panting, staring into his brother's fading gaze. "You took my son," he whispered. "You took my peace, my purpose, my name." He stood up slowly, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. The forest was silent now, save for the breeze rustling the leaves and the distant call of birds. Michael's chest no longer rose. His body lay still, crumpled and lifeless beneath the trees. Daniel looked down at him, waiting for guilt to strike, for grief to come. But all he felt was stillness. Not peace, not joy, just the absence of pain. And somehow that felt like enough. He dragged the body to the edge of the lake and let it sink. watched the ripples disappear. Then he rinsed his hands in the water, changed his clothes, and burned the soiled ones behind the cabin. He cleaned the area meticulously, using gloves and bleach he'd packed for this exact reason. By the time night fell, the forest held no trace of what had transpired. To the world, Michael had left early. Maybe returned to Lagos. Maybe drove elsewhere. Daniel made sure the lodge manager saw him alone at checkout. He left ahead of me, he explained. Family emergency. The manager nodded, unaware. Daniel drove home in silence, his fingers trembling slightly on the steering wheel. When he entered the house, Ifeoma looked up, startled. "You're back early." Daniel said nothing. He simply walked past her, into the bathroom, and stood under the shower for an hour. Washing his skin. Washing the guilt. Washing the last trace of who he had been. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. The days that followed felt like a blur wrapped in glass. Daniel moved through them with robotic precision. Preaching on Sunday, holding meetings during the week, smiling for the congregation. But inside, he was a man adrift in a sea of silence. No one suspected anything. Michael's absence sparked no immediate concern. He had often disappeared for days at a time, running business deals out of state. But each time someone mentioned his brother's name in passing, Daniel's stomach tightened. The act had been committed, the sin sealed. And yet, the world kept turning. The sun still rose. Birds still sang. Was this what justice looked like? Was this what divine silence meant? Approval by omission? Daniel wasn't sure. But he had done what he believed was right. The evil had been removed. Now all that remained was to pick up the shattered pieces of his life. But guilt is never truly buried. It festers beneath the surface, waiting for the quietest moments to speak. Daniel began waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing Michael's voice in the darkness. "He was never yours." Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of movement in mirrors, his own reflection turning away from him. He would kneel to pray, but the words would falter before leaving his lips. The sermons became hollow, like echoes of a man he used to be. Ifeoma noticed but said nothing. The emotional distance between them had widened into a canyon. One night she knocked softly on his study door and asked, "Are you okay?" He looked at her for a long time before whispering, "I don't know what I am anymore." She didn't press further. She simply closed the door behind her, leaving him alone in the dim light. David, ever observant, began asking questions too. "Uncle Michael hasn't come to visit. Did something happen?" Daniel would fake a smile and say, "He's traveling." But the lies weighed heavier each time. At school, David drew another family picture. But this time the stick figure of the uncle had a red X over it. "I don't like him anymore," David said. Daniel stared at the picture, unable to breathe. What was happening to him? To them? He had removed the threat, yes, but the cost was bleeding into every part of his soul. One night, standing in front of the mirror, he saw his hands trembling and realized something chilling. They would never be clean again. Not even holy water could wash off blood that came from vengeance. He had made his choice. And now he would have to live with it, every single day. The questions began to grow heavier in David's small voice, like seeds of doubt blooming into uncomfortable truths. He would enter his parents' room, stand beside Daniel's study door, and ask with innocent curiosity, "Daddy, why don't you and Uncle Michael talk anymore?" Or, "Mommy cried again today. Did I do something wrong?" Daniel, caught between guilt and the instinct to protect his son, would gently pat his head and say, "No, son. You're perfect." But his answers felt thinner with each passing day. Children sense change long before they understand it, and David had begun to notice that laughter had left their home like a guest overstaying its welcome. Ifeoma tried to cover the cracks with affection and prayer, but even she couldn't pretend convincingly anymore. The tension in the house had shifted from quiet grief to something more fragile, like a glass frame moments before it shatters. One evening, as Daniel sat watching a sermon on mute, David approached him with a notebook and a crayon drawing. "Daddy," he said softly, "I wrote a story." Daniel turned, surprised, and took the notebook. Inside was a simple tale, a boy, a mother, and a father who lived happily in a bright house. But there was a shadowy figure standing far off, crossed out in thick black crayon. "That's the bad man," David said. "He tried to take the family, but the daddy made him go away." Daniel stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "Why did the daddy make him go away?" he asked. David looked up at him with calm certainty. "Because he loved the boy. And love means keeping the bad people out." The child hugged him tightly, unaware of how those words pierced his father's soul. Daniel held him back, trembling, and whispered, "Yes, Yes, it does. But as he watched his son walk away, a terrible thought rooted in his chest. What would happen if David ever learned who the bad man truly was? The truth was a ticking bomb Daniel could no longer ignore. People were beginning to ask questions about Michael's disappearance. His office had filed a missing persons report. Detectives had contacted family members. Daniel had remained calm under scrutiny, offering vague answers. We hadn't spoken in a while. He often traveled unannounced. But he knew it couldn't last forever. The walls were closing in. He considered writing a confession just in case. Not to clear his name, but to leave something behind for David if the truth ever surfaced. That night, he opened his journal and began to write. If you're reading this, it means my truth has caught up with me. I wasn't always the man you thought I was. But I loved you more than anything. More than my faith. More than my peace. And with every word he wrote, the weight in his chest grew heavier, because in saving his son's truth, he had destroyed his own. The weight of silence began to suffocate Daniel. Each day the fear of exposure grew stronger. He started seeing Michael in dreams, wet, pale, eyes wide with betrayal, reaching out from beneath the lake's surface. Daniel would jolt awake, gasping, only to find himself drenched in sweat and guilt. The once comforting rituals of prayer and scripture now rang hollow. He tried to confess to God in private, his prayers spilling out in sobs, apologies, screams. I did it, Lord. I did it. But you weren't there. You didn't stop me. But no divine voice answered. Only silence. And that silence grew louder, more accusing. He began avoiding mirrors altogether. Not because he feared judgment, but because he didn't recognize the man staring back. He was no longer the shepherd, no longer the husband, not even the father. He was just a man haunted by his own shadow. On a Sunday morning, Daniel tried to preach again. The topic was the grace that covers all sin. As he stood at the pulpit, the weight of his secret bore down on him like chains. He looked into the sea of expectant faces. Men, women, children who trusted him, believed in him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat closed. His vision blurred. The congregation waited in confused silence as Daniel stood frozen, gripping the podium with trembling hands. Finally, he closed his Bible and whispered into the microphone, "Forgive me." He walked off the altar in silence, leaving stunned ushers and murmuring churchgoers behind. He locked himself in his office, buried his head in his hands, and wept like a man unraveling. That moment would be the turning point. Word spread quickly that something was terribly wrong with the pastor. And Iphioma, who had watched this slow decay for months, knew he couldn't carry it much longer. That night, she confronted him. You need to talk to someone, she said. You can't live like this. You're dying from the inside. Daniel looked at her hollow-eyed and whispered, I'm already dead. Then he stood, walked to his desk, and handed her the journal. If anything happens to me, give this to David when he's old enough to understand. She opened it, began to read, and froze. What is this? She whispered. Daniel turned away. The truth. Her hand shook. You didn't, please tell me you didn't? He said nothing. She fell to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her cries were not just of grief, but of terror. She had seen him broken, yes. But this was something else. She knew then that it was only a matter of time before someone else uncovered what she had just learned. And when that happened, the consequences would be far greater than lost reputations or fractured families. It would be justice and judgment coming home. It happened on a Sunday. The sanctuary was full, the air heavy with incense and expectation. Daniel had returned to the pulpit, dressed in his full clerical robe, looking somber but composed. His sermon that day was titled When the Truth Speaks. He began with Genesis, the story of Cain and Abel. He read aloud, Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. The words hung in the air like thunderclouds. People nodded, moved by the emotion in his voice. But beneath the surface, a different storm was brewing. In the back of the church, 2 plainclothes officers stood silently, waiting. Iphioma sat in the front row, clutching David's hand, her face pale, lips trembling. She had made the call the night before. Not out of hatred, but out of desperation. Daniel was unraveling fast, and if the truth exploded publicly, it would destroy everything. It was time to let justice take its course. Daniel had barely stepped down from the pulpit when he saw them. 2 officers walking toward him, badge in hand. Pastor Daniel Adeoye? One asked. He nodded. You're under arrest for the suspected murder of Michael Adeoye. Gasps echoed across the church. Ushers froze. Congregants stood, stunned. David looked up at his mother in confusion, tugging her sleeve. "Why are they taking Daddy?" She pulled him close and said nothing. Daniel didn't resist. He handed his Bible to the assistant pastor, turned to the congregation and said, "Pray for me." Then he walked down the aisle between rows of shocked parishioners, hands behind his back. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The man of God, now a man in chains. That moment would be broadcast across every screen in Nigeria by nightfall. From pulpit to prison, the headlines screamed. And Living Word Ministries, once a beacon of hope, was now a house of scandal. The interrogation was long, brutal, relentless. Detectives laid out evidence, timelines, inconsistencies. Ifeoma's statement. Financial traces. GPS records. But Daniel said little. "I did what I believed was right," he told them. "That's all I'll say." When asked where Michael's body was, he looked at the wall and murmured, "Only God knows." The media circus erupted. Protesters gathered. Church members split into camps. Those who believed it was a smear campaign, and those who demanded justice. But for Daniel, none of that mattered anymore. He was finally unburdened. The secret was out. And while the price was high, he welcomed it. In his prison cell, he sat alone with his Bible and journal, reading over his own confession. He thought about David, his laughter, his questions, his future. He knew he might never see him again outside a visitation window. But maybe, just maybe, telling the truth was the first real sermon he had preached in years. 6 months passed. The trial had begun. Media flooded the courtroom. The prosecution painted Daniel as a calculating murderer, while the defense tried to frame it as a tragic consequence of emotional collapse. Witnesses came forward. Forensic evidence, testimonies, journal entries. Everything was dissected under the sterile glare of justice. But Daniel said little. He never denied what he had done. "I lost my way," he said once when asked why he did it. "I stopped hearing God's voice. I started hearing my pain instead." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the verdict came in, guilty, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a verse under his breath. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." He was sentenced to life in prison. No chance for parole. The courtroom buzzed, but Daniel felt strangely at peace. It was over. From prison, Daniel wrote letters to David every month. He filled pages with stories, prayers, confessions, and love. He asked for nothing in return, only that one day his son would understand. Ifeoma read the letters before giving them to David, often weeping at the raw honesty in Daniel's words. David, now older and more curious, began to piece things together. The story of the uncle who vanished. The trial. The whispers at school. One day he asked his mother directly, "Did Daddy kill Uncle Michael?" She froze, then nodded slowly. "Yes. But he didn't stop being your father." David didn't respond. He just looked out the window, deep in thought. A week later he asked to visit the prison. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon, he stepped into the visitation room where Daniel waited in his orange jumpsuit, eyes hollow but hopeful. They stared at each other through the glass, neither speaking at first. Then David picked up the phone and said quietly, "Should I still call you Daddy?" Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted the receiver. "That's up to you," he said. "But I will always call you my son." A tear rolled down David's cheek. He pressed his palm to the glass. Daniel did the same. In that moment, no bars could hold back the flood of emotion between them.